Hello and welcome to another episode of the Tigers Down Under. It's another grim episode this week. I mean, we've kind of gotten used to it in a sad sort of way. The 4 or 5 goal margins that we've been sort of regularly facing the last few weeks. I've got Brad along to chat about the Bournemouth game.
Good evening.
I'll start with your views on the game, Brad, before I have a bit of a rant about the game myself. But how did you see the game and what were your views of it?
Well, I don't know whether it was just me, but when you saw the pink uniform threw me off. I think it was a French team, French rugby team or something was the last time I saw a pink uniform. But all that aside, it was probably one of the most disappointing matches I think I've seen us ever play. It sort of didn't start well. It got worse. Then, as we've been saying against some of the top four teams, we hope to get through without an injury. Well, then to lose Robertson at the end of it was just pretty much summed up how diabolical the night was, or the day was, I should say. At one stage there in the first half, for all those Australian viewers, they might understand that I started the viewing experience with a lot of buffering, and I probably wish in the end there was more buffering because. It was pretty rubbish night, pretty rubbish game.
Yeah, I can't disagree with any of that. And you're right. I mean, it was from the first whistle. We just looked on the back foot. We were sitting off them, and giving them so much space. And I think that first goal came within the first 3 or 4 minutes as well. So it wasn't even as if we had any time to sort of settle into the game and try and get a foothold. It was sort of one down before you know it. And to be honest, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if we hadn't laid 10 tackles for the first half. It was just really soft, really sort of sitting off them and just letting them do as they pleased, which was really disappointing to see. Because, I mean, Davies made a really good comment after the game when he was being pretty blunt about the way we played, and he sort of said, you know, in previous weeks we've been playing the big four teams, or we've had a player sent off, or we've had this, that and the other, so sort of used as an excuse. But playing Bournemouth, full fit squad pretty much, apart from Mbakani and obviously the pre-existing ones in Bruce and Otabajo and McGregor, but essentially a fully fit squad up against a side that hasn't been in amazing form. They've been decent at home, but not amazing. But a side that you would have thought we'd at least have a crack at, and we got it back to 1-1, which was optimistic, but then from there it just all went completely downhill.
Look, and maybe the 1-1 was the crucial turning point. We started the game like we were Hollywood superstars and didn't do any hard work. And then obviously went, shit, we've got to start moving our butts, score an equaliser so we're back in the game, and then think we're going to coast again.
Yeah.
And it was clearly, we all know these guys do a mountain of work on the training track. Preparation for each game is probably the same no matter who they're playing, but clearly mentally the whole squad just wasn't there or together.
Keane was the interesting one as well up top, because I was quite interested to see how he went when he got given that start, because quite often we'll have a player, for instance, in our second Premier League season under Bruce when we bought Maguire, and he just sort of sat on the bench until he got loaned out, and we sort of went, oh, you know, it would have been good to see how he played. So it was really promising to see Keane get given a start so we could at least see how he played, but to be honest, I mean, I barely saw him in the first half. I think he only had one touch for the half, and obviously you can't heap all the blame at his feet because the team as a whole really didn't show up, and there was no sort of attacking impetus, but that's such a disappointing return from a striker.
Look, it was, and I suppose we're all pretty surprised with him as a starting option, but I didn't really rate his performance, but then again, I didn't really rate anyone's.
Yeah.
Probably the only thing that concerned me a little bit, and of course, I'm certainly not paid big bucks to run a team, so my experience doesn't count for much. But you would have almost thought that, you know, ludicrously, Maguire was at the wrong end of the pitch.
Yeah.
If we had played Maguire in that sort of true old school centre forward role, holding the ball up, we may have been able to defend a bit higher because we had someone who was genuinely able to sit and hold a ball. But Keane's forte seems to be more about, you know, trying to get on the end of them than sort of pushing up the park and collecting the ball. But look, he wasn't alone. I'm not putting any real blame on him. I think you can blame everyone in the squad.
And just on Keane as well with the start, are you a bit concerned that Hernandez didn't even come off the bench? I mean, that's 2 games in a row now where he's been benched. Do you start to see it perhaps as a rift with Phelan, or is it sort of, are we almost certain to see him next game to try and rev him back up, or what do you reckon's going on there?
Look, look, the first time out I can understand. I think that the formation side of things probably played with Phelan's head a little bit this time, but whether he's had a rift or there's a rift with Hernandez and Phelan, I don't know. But at least there's been games, even early doors, where we haven't, say, controlled the play for 90 minutes, but Hernandez has sort of looked like threatening. Probably the only thing that's probably hurt him in recent weeks is the whole team hasn't exactly performed well. And if you're a striker and Hernandez isn't lazy, but he can look lazy, you probably look like the worst player in the 11, especially if you're not scoring goals.
And then I guess the other player I wanted to mention was Marshall, just because when Jakupovic got dropped after the game against Arsenal, a couple of us on here were chatting about would Marshall be held to the same standards that Jakupovic was, and there was a lot of criticism, I thought, quite unfair in some senses about Jakupovic's performance against Arsenal, where I think he was sort of potentially at fault for the first goal, the other one's not really, and I mean he saved a penalty as well, so he didn't have a terrible game by any stretch, but he obviously was dropped after that, and Marshall came in, and the question was, would Marshall be held to that same standard? And we've now seen him concede, I think it's 17 goals in 4 games, which is utterly ridiculous as a keeper in your 4 games, regardless of, whether they're 30-yard screamers or tap-ins in the box. There has to be some blame at some point given to the keeper for that situation. Whether you just look at it from the point of view of, well, he's not organising his defence in a way that would suit him as a keeper. For instance, we saw against Bournemouth, I thought for the first goal, his organisation of the wall was really poor. He sort of brought in more players than I think he needed for the wall, but then he set them up quite to the left of the goal. So when the ball hit the crossbar, the Bournemouth player could pretty much just run in straight on and tap it into the net. And there's got to be a few questions asked. And I think even just from his point of view, giving him a rest mentally might be a good way to go and give Jakupovic a run out.
Yeah, look, I think they're all valid points. I think probably in the emotion of things, I would have called for Marshall's head every week for the last 3 weeks. But I think in the scheme of things now, looking back over the goals, if we're saying, and I've got nothing to doubt your figures there, if there's 17 goals conceded under Marshall's watch, I could probably point the blame, firmly at his feet for 2.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Maybe 3. But your interesting point there was the organisation of the back 4 or back 3 or back 6, whatever we're playing any time, is Jakupovic seemed to be, love him or hate him, he's a pretty emotional dude. He loves, clapping the Arsenal supporters at one hand and yelling at someone the next. It may be that Marshall just doesn't quite command that back 4 or move those jigsaw pieces around as well as Jakupovic. Or maybe, the back 4 don't trust Jakupovic, so they're more switched on. I don't know.
Yeah.
But I think you've got to start saying, look, if something's wrong, you've got to try and make a change.
And you're absolutely right. I'm not suggesting that Marshall has had, for instance, McGregor last season against Wolves when he dropped the ball and Wolves just tapped it in. I'm not suggesting Marshall's at fault to that extent. But yeah, as you've picked up on, it's more that organisation of the defence and even just, I mean, you look at, for instance, the game against Manchester United versus the game against Liverpool, for instance. There's 2 really comparable games where we've gone into the game and clearly tried to sit back and just defend and not give them any sort of chances to win the game. And United at the time were flying. I mean, they'd won their first 3 games of the season. They might have won their first 2 games of the season, and they were actually in some pretty decent form. And Jakupovic held them out until the 93rd or 94th minute, and we lost the game 1-0. And when you compare that to Arsenal or Chelsea or Liverpool or whoever it is that we've faced in recent weeks, clearly something's changed, and whether that's just a general confidence in the players or whether that's something to do with the keeper or it's some combination of the 2. It's really hard to say, and maybe, as you say, maybe the players are more switched on when Yak's in goal because they think they have to have more responsibility and they can't just rely on the keeper. But who knows? But I think whether we just give Marshall a rest and say, for the game against Stoke, we say, well, we'll give Jakupovic a chance. It gives Marshall a chance to sort of refresh himself, and it also might give him a bit of a, a bit of a shake-up where he kind of says, oh, I've got to refocus and I've really got to pull up my socks and really, earn my spot in the side, I guess.
Yeah, and I think it's probably more so this week going to be, okay, we know who we've got. We've got to get 3 points. Who does Phelan have the most faith in to get the job done? And he's pretty much just got to grab them by the throat and say, this is how you prove that I know what I'm doing and you're the man for the job.
Yeah, absolutely. Just one final question. It's probably one that we don't really want to consider for too long, just in terms of history. It's our equal worst loss in the Premier League. We also lost to Liverpool 6-1. I think it was in our second Premier League season back in 2009-2010, where Torres kind of tore us apart. If your memory stretches back far enough, would this be almost our worst ever Premier League performance?
Yeah, I think it would. Purely from start to finish, it was the worst. The Liverpool one, probably the only saving grace that day was, bless his heart, Liam Cooper got thrown to the wolves, and probably is never been the same since. But you got to remember at that stage, whilst Liverpool weren't the top side in English football, Torres was clearly on his game. Yeah. And the thing that probably, to compare the two, Bournemouth are a team that we should be taking a point from all the time. And whereas Liverpool, both home or away, although they've been in our pocket when we play them at home, there's someone we sort of, aspire to. So probably it's up there with, and those that remember, I think it was maybe the second or third game we ever played. We got trounced by Wigan 5-0 at home, I think it was. When Wayne Brown was in the back four, and I remember he never looked the same after that day either. But probably the difference this time for me is all those bad results aside, the Wigan one was close because we thought we were a real chance after knocking off Fulham. But this one is a real shock to where we thought we were at.
Yeah, and I think that's the key is losing to a side that you would think would be someone you'd actually be able to have a chance against. And from the other side of things, it reminds me of, in a way, of that Fulham game where we knocked them off 6-0, where from a Fulham fan's perspective, that surely must have been such a disastrous result, especially in that game because it was 0-0 at half time. To go down 6-0 in the second half would be so demoralising. And whilst we scored a goal through Ryan Mason, I mean, it doesn't really feel like it was any sort of consolation because, well, first of all, it was a deflection, so it's a bit of a lucky goal to begin with, but just the way that we gave them the ball and let them do what they wanted, and particularly at the end of the game, I think they scored 2 goals in the last 5 minutes or something, so it wasn't even as if we had any sort of ambition to sort of stem the bleeding or make it look respectable. We just dropped our heads.
Yeah, that's the best way to sum it up. I think probably our heads were never up.
Yeah, fair point. We'll move to off-field matters then, which is slightly more optimistic. And we put out the request in the group to see if there were any topics that people wanted us to cover. And unsurprisingly, I guess the most common topic that people wanted us to talk about that's on everyone's minds at the moment is the news of the takeover or lack of news until recently, with people sort of wondering why there was this stall in negotiations. And it's kind of funny timing in a way, as I was saying to you before we went to air, that in the last 24 hours all of this news all of a sudden about a couple of different interested parties has come to light, and we had news of this £130 million bid from the Hong Kong Chinese consortium, which I think Adam Pearson has links to, and hidden at the bottom of an article by the Hull Daily Mail, there was a suggestion that there's a group in Germany that actually are closer to finalising a takeover of the club than the Far East Asian group. So without obviously knowing too many details about either deal, what are you making of this sort of news, or is it just more of the same that we've already had these 2 failed bids? This is just more hope rather than fact?
Oh, look, I think there's a bit of hope this time, because the only time I felt hope in this whole process was after the Leicester game, when we knew we had people, visiting the ground and all these wonderful things. They've gone to the trouble to do it. But probably the only thing that has held some faith for me anyway is to see Adam Pearson still involved.
Yep.
Clearly, he's not a man who mucks around. We know his love for the club is pretty deep-seated, and if he's involved, he's not wasting his time on something that's not going to happen. He's genuinely going to put his time and energy into something that he thinks can get across the line. Probably the only thing, and call me a pessimist when it comes to the alums, but it's almost like every time we're getting close to something, there's these new consortiums from all over Far East India coming on board to take us over. And I often wonder, and knowing that not much gets past the alums on this front, it wouldn't surprise me if they're responsible for some of the leagues to bump the price.
Yeah, and I do agree. And also the other one that everyone theorises about sometimes is whenever there's sort of a bit of grumbling of unrest and upset amongst the supporter base, right before a home game they might leak something to sort of quell any sense of protest and give people the sense that any minute now they're on the way out. And the only reason I'd suggest it's slightly different this time with this Hong Kong group is the news actually came to light because they had to report to the Hong Kong Stock Exchange because they're a listed company. So that's the only thing that makes this one slightly different to me, because the alums didn't control the leak. It wasn't like Sky Sports News or the Daily Mail or the Yorkshire Post are the ones breaking the story. Yeah, and
clearly the last time we saw some activity, I think you and I might have talked about it then too, we didn't hold a lot of sway because Duffield's got him watching the under 23s or whatever it was at the time, and we pretty much knew that meant that it was dead in the water if Duffield was fishing around. But pretty much this time, we at some stage something's going to stick, or Pearson will walk away. There's no doubt he's not going to spend the whole year trying to make this work. It always seems to be when we're getting close, we hear some rumblings and the price might get pushed up. But I just wish it'd be all over. I think we're all drained by it.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And it's interesting as well because I've seen a few rumours on Twitter which could be completely unfounded that Pearson has already sort of done a bit of homework on this group and ensured that they would actually be fit and proper, so to speak, because as we know that was the stumbling block for the last Chinese group, who I'm actually surprised have sort of slipped into the background because they were sort of making a bit of noise that they weren't going to give up on it because they'd already, I think, given the alums a £6 or £7 million deposit, which is a pretty big motivator for them to sort of try and shake up their consortium and get back through the process and get ticked off by the Premier League. So I don't know what's quite happened with them, but if this new group has sort of unofficially already ticked that box in Adam Pearson's eyes at least, that might give some sort of indication that they're a bit more reliably able to get through that process from the Premier League point of view.
Yeah, that's right, and clearly the first bid, if they've crept away quietly like they have, then the fit and proper persons test must have been a bit of an eye-opener by the looks of it.
Which is amazing when you think people like Cellino can pass it.
Oh, that's exactly right, mate. I always laugh when they talk about fit and proper person because really it's about how much money you've got and what the PL thinks is going to end up in the league's best interest rather than maybe just the club's.
So, I mean, in some senses you look at that and perhaps say that we dodged a bullet. If it was so bad that the Premier League weren't satisfied with ticking them off, it's probably, I mean, in a way it's interesting that people sort of look at it as they'd rather anyone than the alums, but you've got to draw a line somewhere and say, well, actually, better the devil you know in some senses.
Yeah, it's always interesting. Clearly there's not a fit and proper test in the Championship for owners.
Could they be making their way there this evening with a goal in normal time, or will they need extra time or penalties if they are to do so? This is Weir. Gets the ball into the centre, and Hull have snatched it! It's Henriksen and Maloney as well. They were the two targets, and Hull City have snatched it right at the death.
So we've just heard a return to our goal music, which we haven't actually had for a few weeks because of the calibre of the opposition and the fact we haven't had any easily accessible YouTube highlights of victories against them. But we've already played this opponent once this season in the Cup, and of course we have Stoke City at home this weekend in a pretty do-or-die clash. I mean, you've already touched on touched on that, Brad, that they sit, I think, only 1 point below us in the table now after such a poor start from them. It really is. It's I hesitate to call it a must-win, but it's a must-not-lose, surely.
Yeah, I think you're right. That's probably the best way to put it. I always worry when we play games like this where we have to win or we should win because we're at home against Stoke and they're rubbish. And the one thing that I always hate is I hate playing Stoke anyway because they always seem to have some jaggy bastard that scores some cracking goal that makes us look bad. But when we played them in the Cup, I actually thought we were no chance. I thought we'd end up running out a reserve style side, keep everyone fit, and we'd be lucky if we can get within a goal or two. But obviously, we surprised on that night. But probably the thing that I think gives us some hope is that because we were that bad on the weekend, there's only one response, and that's got to be the players have got to really show that last week was rubbish and it's not them. And there's obviously going to be some changes because Phelan would be mad if he didn't. And with that in mind, has he got some players there that are going to come in and show that they should be there on a regular basis? So there's a lot to prove other than just the 3 points. It's probably going to be whether that team unified approach that we saw in the first few rounds of the season can come back.
Well, you've touched on it there, and we didn't really cover it in the review of the Bournemouth game, not that there were many players who cover themselves in glory to earn best on ground sort of votes from us, but who would you drop from the side and who do you reckon has secured their place in the side for this game?
Well, look, from my perspective, the only one that probably is guaranteed a spot is Clucas.
Yeah.
I mean, again, if you listen to the previous podcast, I've pretty much given him best player every game I've been on. But he was still a bit of a shining light in patches there, and he got pushed from position to position. And whilst he's not necessarily a great-looking left back, he still showed his worth in a pretty poor setup. Other than that, I mean, if we're looking at formations and who can come in this week and make a difference, the only thing I can think of is the quality of those individuals that played last week are thereabouts our best 11 to 13 players. So you just need to make a change, not necessarily based on who the best 11 or 13 players are, but who's going to get a job done. And I'd go back and look at what's changed in recent weeks. Should Marshall go? It's not a bad time to send a message, but then again, you're going to have to send other messages at the same time, and you don't want to cause a massive issue. Look, the bigger picture, obviously, was with Robertson out. What are we going to do with that left-back spot?
Well, yeah, and I mean, there's been some rumours that Josh Tymon might be handed a Premier League debut. And one of the main reasons I'd be very happy for that to happen was, I don't know if you've seen the article about him, that he's on something like, was it 160 quid a week or something? So
Yeah.
I'd love to be able to say to myself that I'm earning more than a Premier League footballer.
Well, if he makes the bench, it's still the same thing, isn't it?
Yeah, well, exactly.
I think for me, obviously we don't know how fit Dawson is. I know there's been stories that he'll come in this week. I believe with the squad we've got and who should play in what position, I would give Tymon a run.
Do we go three at the back?
Yeah. Look, if we go three at the back, and I'm going to upset people here, I wouldn't actually. If Dawson's fit, I would play Dawson Davies and Livermore as a back three.
Okay.
And purely because of the fact that Dawson will probably be a little bit underdone, but we know how good he can be, especially setting up that back three. And we all feel a bit safer with Dawson around. The thing that I again is going to upset some people, Maguire still looks very rusty.
Yeah.
And it's easy to say that when you lose 6-1, but apart from some real crunching tackles, he really looked out of place. His teammates made that look worse, but I'm still not convinced that he is in our first choice defence. And we had a great run last year without him, and I still think he's a great quality player. But knowing what we've got to do this week, Livermore, Dawson and Davies would be my back three, and then that leaves Elmo to do what he does best, and that's not defend. And therefore it may take some of the heat off that left-back position, because we'd be looking at Snodgrass covering from that sort of left wing-back slot. It also means, I think anyway, that you're playing the best players that you can. So with a 5-man midfield, we're clearly blessed with some good midfielders, not last week, but as a squad. Well, it now gives him, let's say, 3 central midfield spots to fill.
Yeah.
And one thing we're not short of is centralised midfielders.
Yeah. Would you play Myler in there?
Look, I would.
Over perhaps Huddleston?
Yeah, look, I would. I was critical of him in recent games, not in recent games, probably about 3 or 4 games ago. It might have been the Arsenal game. I was pretty disappointed with his distribution, but he's not very good at it anyway. But there's no doubt that you just got to go back to those first couple of the games of the season when we were sticky all over the park. We stuck together. We were, some people remember in the old days of football training, sometimes you'd tie the defenders together literally with a piece of rope so they would know how to move across the pitch together. We played like that in those first 2 rounds, like we were a real stuck unit. And I think that if we were able to go back to that squad and have a look at what was the glue, Myler was part of that glue.
Yes, I agree.
Not so much in the attacking sense, but let's face it, doesn't matter about attack at the moment when we're conceding 6 against a half-baked side.
Yeah, and I think you're spot on, and I think it's something that Bruce failed to recognise a little bit in the season we got relegated, when he pretty much chucked guys like Stephen Quinn, Liam Rosenior, Paul McShane out of the side in favour of some of the newer blokes, and we lost some of that spirit. And I think that's really underrated in a football team. And you just look at the results we got against Leicester and against Swansea, and we had that togetherness because, it was sort of a quirk of fate that we had these only 13 fit players available, but they were all the players that really stuck together and had good team spirit. And Davies was looking better, Myler was looking better, even Huddleston was looking better because we had that togetherness. And I think, as you say, Myler was a huge part of that. And you just look at how he is off the field and on social media and things like that, and you can tell he loves the club and he has a real passion for it. And he's certainly, whilst he, as you say, he might be a bit loose in his passing and things like that, but he gets stuck in, he'll do the dirty work, and he'll break up play quite well. And we sorely lacked that against Bournemouth.
Yeah, exactly. And it's time to actually start saying, right, if people aren't performing, irrespective of names, you're out. And Quinn's a prime example. I know we're going back in history here, but we nearly snatched an FA Cup final win with Quinn playing in sort of a number 10 type role because we didn't have anyone else. Yet he put his heart and soul into it to the point where he did not look out of place. And in fact, probably went up miles in my book as well. If we don't use this squad that we're going to have to use for 38 games this year, there's no point sort of just rolling out Huddleston and Mason and whoever just because of their reputation as being a once-off England training camp member. We've actually got to say, do you know what? We're playing a game this week where we need boys to pull up their socks and go in bloody hard. And Myler epitomises that. You can always make a change if Myler's not running well. But the one thing we know is Myler's not going to necessarily cause us any defensive frailties. It's going to be more on the attacking front that he's not going to give us what we need, and we can make that change.
Yeah. Looking at sort of a doomsday scenario here, if we were to lose to Stoke, say we lost 2 or 3-0, as soon as it would be, how much pressure comes on Phelan all of a sudden?
Well, yeah, it's a hard one because really he's got the job at the moment purely on the basis of catching the champions on the hop, looking pretty good against Man U and a bit of a cup run. Over time, that loses its gloss, and the job really at hand is to get enough points to stay up. And I think the guys that were chatting a few weeks ago were talking about this string of games and trying to get 13 or 14 points. He can still obviously show he's the man for the job if he's getting around that double-digit points mark out of this run of games. But after that, every coach or every manager's under pressure that's in the same position. And you've also probably going to have the ability for new owners to come in and, who knows, maybe want to stamp their special one mentality onto it and think there's someone who can rescue it before the halfway mark.
You mentioned cup run, so we'll chat briefly about the cup game coming up midweek next week before I'll get a score prediction from you for both games. We do face Bristol City away from home next, I think it's Wednesday, it must be Wednesday night English time, Thursday morning our time, I think it is, I'll double check that. It gives us a real chance to move into the quarterfinals for only the second time in our history, but 2 seasons in a row potentially. So from your point of view, how important is it to keep a cup run going for confidence perhaps, or do you just see it as something that we should just exit as it's a bit of a distraction?
No, look, I'd throw our best at it. You see how we get through this weekend, but we've now got something, and it's laughable after the weekend, but we've now got something we haven't had since last season, and that's a little bit of depth. We haven't got just one out-and-out striker. We've got some midfielders. Everyone's going to be trying to prove a point. So I still think, as long as the players are fit, we should always still be picking our best 11. And let's face it, if we get through this weekend with a draw or win and have a good cup week, it will lift the place. And I sort of think that after last weekend, the place should be pretty depressed. And so anything that's going to lift that vibe of things is going to help. So I'd have a real tilt at it.
So it is next Wednesday morning, so Tuesday night English time. So if you would go in with a pretty much full-strength side, who are the players that you would be looking to bring in to perhaps give them a bit of a run out that haven't really got a run recently? I mean, the name that pops to mind for me is Weir, because he looked quite promising against Stoke when he played in the previous round of the Cup, and he just doesn't seem to have had much of a look in the league so far.
Yeah, and look, and certainly my thoughts on formation this week would mean that he wouldn't probably play on the weekend. But yeah, I would start him in the Cup because there's a good chance that you'd need to give Elmo a rest. If it is Tuesday night, that turnaround's a bit tight. But look, probably the only thing at the moment is I'm not aware of how much game time Keane's actually had before last weekend. But clearly Phelan rates him. Clearly Phelan thinks he's going to be able to score goals. It wouldn't hurt to give him a run with one of our better choice strikers, depending on who's fit come the time. But if the question's more about Saturday, I'd really be saying at the moment I've got sort of a bit of a question mark over all of that midfield, and Klukas and Myler would probably play a part with maybe Mason in front of them or even Henriksen.
Presumably we'll see Yak in goal against Bristol City if we're not going to see him against Stoke. Do you think there's much he could do in that game to change Phelan's mind about his place in the side, or do you think if Phelan decides to stick with Marshall against Stoke, then that's pretty much set and Marshall would have to have a total shocker to be dropped?
Yeah, the one thing that always worries me is what Marshall was promised to come and join us. Did Phelan get him over because he said, I want you as my number one? And pretty much if that's going to be the case, it's going to take 10 games of really poor goalkeeping before he'll get dropped. I don't think it's more about what Yak can do in the Cup. I think it's more about what Marshall can do on Saturday. I think Marshall, if he's not getting close to this seesaw, he's getting maybe a week or two away from a real decision having to be made. I don't think it's all entirely his fault, but like I said originally, you've got to make changes.
I didn't actually intend this podcast to be a super campaign for Yak, but I think that's what it's sort of turned into. I know we've talked about the goalkeeping situation quite a bit, almost unintentionally, but there are sort of debates to be had all over the pitch, I suppose. And the other one, I guess, is when we'll see Hernandez again. Hopefully, it could potentially be in both of these games because, to be honest, I think giving him a run out against Bristol City in the Cup might do him the world of good because he obviously scored against Swansea, and you could kind of argue that he scored against Leicester with that bicycle kick that they both pretty much put in, but he hasn't really looked like scoring since then. I think he had a few decent chances against Burnley, but that's all I can think of off the top of my head. So if he can put a goal or two away against Bristol City, for instance, that could really do him the world of good.
Look, it could, and leading into the Stoke game, I would probably play him and start him. I'd go back if we're going to play that sort of 3-5-2. I would play him up the top, and I'd bring Diamande in to hold up the ball for him. Give him someone with some clout around him.
Since we roasted him a couple of weeks ago, he came on against, I think it was Chelsea, and looked quite impressive. Or sorry, he might have started against Chelsea and looked quite impressive. And then he didn't look out of place against Bournemouth when he came on late in that one either. So he has looked a little bit better recently.
Yeah, look, I think I was a bit critical of him sort of probably games 2 to 4, that he looks a bit lazy or a bit lethargic or whatever it is. But, I mean, I'm not an expert, not sure what his proven position is, but as that sort of advanced attacking player, he's got some touch. And if you're giving Hernandez the right to sort of run around and terrorise the strikers behind him, I think it could be what we need against Stoke.
So we've gone a bit over time here because there's been plenty to discuss, but I'll get a score prediction from you now for both the Stoke and also the Bristol City games.
Yeah, look, I actually am going to be the optimist this week. I think we'll beat Stoke 2-0.
And do you reckon we'll get through in the Cup?
Look, I do. I actually think that Phelan will probably be happy with the weekend's result. He want to rest most of those players, but test the guys who don't get a run, and I think we'll probably give Bristol City a bit of a hiding in the Cup.
And then I guess the big question is, who do you see as having the most at stake this week?
Yeah, it's a good one. Look, I'm assuming that probably Mason's going to start, and I think although he scored a goal and those sorts of things, since he's come in, that midfield hasn't quite worked as well. We know he's a quality player, and I know that takes time to adjust, but it clearly worked a bit better early doors when you had Klukas sitting in behind, say, a Huddleston and Myler, that combative midfield, whereas we're probably trying to play a bit more above us, our position in the table, a bit more attacking, and Mason fits that bill, but sometimes I wonder whether he's defensively minded enough.
Yeah.
So I think Mason,
I think I'm going to be a bit of a pessimist and say I think Stoke are on the up at the moment, and I do get the feeling they might come here and knock us off. And I'm just hoping it's a close game, perhaps 2-1 or something like that. But I'm feeling a bit glum going into that one. Joe Allen looks in some pretty fantastic form for them. I think we should get past Bristol, because I think we've kind of had that attitude in the Cup this season where we've really gone out and given it a go. And as you say, I mean, Phelan's played pretty strong lineups, and I think we will be looking to play some of the players back into form in that one. So I could see us, 2-3-1, 3-0 sort of thing going through in that game. And then a bit outside the box, I'm going to go with Phelan having the most at stake this week, because I reckon if we lose both games, there'll be a lot of pressure on him. And it sort of plays into your point about Mason, is we actually almost looked better when he didn't have any options and he didn't have much scope to stuff up. And now that we've got this depth, it's almost like he doesn't really know what to do with it. And potentially that's sort of highlighting his failings or his shortcomings as a manager. So, Klukas as that pivot in midfield is a masterstroke, but I think we need to see a few more creative moves from him, because first few games of the season, it seemed like everything he did, every lineup was really well set up, really well researched, and it was the perfect way to attack the given team that we played that week. But since that Arsenal game, it just feels like pretty much everything's fallen apart, and we're just sort of drifting from one game to the next.
Yeah, good point. And really, you could argue that the Klukas sort of masterstroke was probably already in play with Bruce.
Yeah,
anyway,
I think he was playing there early in pre-season. So you're right.
Yeah, so I think you probably nailed it, mate. I think it's showing that he's got at the moment, his scorecard as a manager, besides obviously the Leicester game and the team bonding side of things, is tactically is sort of 0 from 5.
Yeah, well, hopefully I'm wrong. Hopefully we can get a great morale-boosting win against Stoke and then smash Bristol City to get through in the Cup as well. And we can have a really positive week. So thank you so much for coming on, Brad.
No worries. Thanks for having me, mate.
And thank you everyone for listening in. As I've said, hopefully by this time next week we're singing our praises and we're, 3 points in the league, through in the Cup to the quarterfinals, and everything's looking a bit rosier. So until then, come on City! You've been listening to the official Hull City Australia podcast. For more discussion, join us on Facebook in the Hull City AFC Australian Supporters Group, or follow us on Twitter at Hull City AFC Oz. The music was created by Amber and Black.
City's on fire. We're going higher and higher. There's no turning back 'cause you're out.